Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. You might notice that I am not Caleb Keith. My name is, in fact, Dr. John Hoyum. I've been informed that I'm supposed to use the title, even though I am against using it for myself. We thank you for listening to the Thinking Fellows, which is, of course, part of the 1517 podcast network of shows, which means that you should go to 1517.org/podcasts and check out all of the resources that we have there. But that's not all. 1517 is not only a podcast network, it is also a content creation center for pretty much whatever you want, which means that you should check out all of the other things that we have there for you, like blog posts and conferences and academy courses, and most of it, except for the conferences, is all for free. So go over to 1517.org and check out everything we have there for you. Okay, so I'm not Caleb, I'm not the usual host, but I do know a little bit about what Thinking Fellows is supposed to look like, which means we're going to have a freewheeling discussion. And today, we're going to be talking about the dreaded subject among Lutherans, known as virtue ethics.
Don't you wish it were dreaded? It is not dreaded.
Well, I think it's dreaded in our circles. But
I just want to start out by saying that, so far, John is a better host than Caleb, and I think that we might want to have a secret conversation after this to discuss a trade.
Like, don't
they do that in sports? They sometimes will trade one person for another, offer them more money, such thing. So far, so good.
Yeah, do we have anything else on the front end that we want to say, or do we want to dive?
Well, this came in, so Caleb was supposed to be here, but he flew away to Michigan to go teach at Camp Arcadia. But this came up last week when he received an email. It was a very nice email as part, maybe it was a comment as part of the podcast survey that's gone out, or something like that. But some correspondence where I think it was from a pastor in Finland, a Lutheran pastor in Finland, that said, "I love Thinking Fellows. I love the show. It's very helpful. Hey, have you guys ever done a show on virtue ethics? Because a lot of the young Lutheran pastors that I mentor here are totally wrapped up in virtue ethics, and I can't figure out whether this is helpful or harmful." And he said, "Would you guys do a show on it?" So Caleb knows that this is sort of, and I wouldn't really call it, I haven't talked about it in a long time, one of my hobby horses, but he said, "Hey, you'd really like this comment." So that's how this came about. So I think the question is, and maybe we can let Bruce do Bruce's thing and explain it to us. But other than that, is this helpful or harmful? I've got a, when Bruce is done, I've got a way to explain it via Batman that might be helpful too.
Well, your Batman way is going to be much better than,
so.
Okay, I guess, John, you might be better at explaining how the conversation enters into Lutheran circles, but just in general, virtue ethics is a way of looking at morality, and it's usually talked about by contrasting it with two other ways of looking at morality, which is deontology and consequentialism. And those words are fancy words, but they're actually concepts we're all familiar with, and they're pretty easy. So one way you can look at morality is deontology, and that just emphasizes rules. So you do something because it's the right thing to do. So you're not a virtue ethicist if you do something because it's the right thing to do. You're technically, in the purest sense of the definition, you're a deontologist. Consequentialism is kind of
just one thing here. As a segment of deontology, so this is the right thing to do, overarching in the universe, things are right, things are wrong, and they're handed down somehow to you. This can be via natural law. But one of the ways that Christians are familiar with that this is handed down is called divine decree, right? So that you have a divinity, and this divinity says, this is right and this is wrong. Right. So
you can have modern notions that are secular, but yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But for our Christian listeners, a part of this would be sort of just accepting that the 10 Commandments, as handed down by God, are the ultimate sort of judge of what is actually right and what is actually wrong. Thou shalt not murder. Murder's wrong. Don't murder people. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Adultery is wrong. Stay faithful to your wife. That type. Right?
Yep. So that's the deontology rules that are given. Consequentialism is just a form of moral reasoning where you say, I'm going to do this because it maximizes the good. It's a type of utilitarianism. So why do I behave the way I behave? It maximizes the good. it's better to do more good than to do more bad. So I just anticipate what the consequences of my actions will be, and then I act rightly in accordance with that anticipation. But neither of those, although they're close, are quite what virtue ethics is, because virtue ethics, which is grounded in a conversation from Plato and then mostly Aristotle, essentially says that you act the way that you should act because it's for its own ethical, virtuous good. You're not acting to meet a law, to follow a law, and you're not acting because you've weighed the consequences of your actions and that's what you're going to do. You're acting that way because, in a sense, it's who you are, because you've cultivated this sense within yourself. So I wrote a little example. Maybe your Batman example will help at this point, Scott, but the example I used is like, and this I found in a philosophy textbook, an honest person who acts honestly because they think it's just better for society would be a utilitarian or a consequentialist. An honest person who tries to act that way because they think that it's the thing you should do. You should act honestly on the test. Okay, that's a deontologist. But a person who's a virtue ethicist says that their entire demeanor is about honesty. You don't act that way because there's a rule, and you don't act that way because it's good for society. You act that way, it's because you're being true to yourself, because it's who you are. So one of the things about virtue ethics is, and this is one of the criticisms of it, is it's very self-centered, ironically, even though it's made to be good, to bring good into the world. You're always thinking about yourself in the conversation of virtue ethics. Another criticism would be there's no guidance on how to act in virtue ethics. The honest person is supposed to always behave in an honest way and think in an honest way and surround themselves with honest people and love honest things if honesty is a virtue.
Wouldn't virtue ethics people say that there is guidance, but there's no specific rules? So the whole thing is guidance. That's sort of how I always wrap my head around it. The whole thing is guidance, but none of it's specificity. So it's not like this is right, this is wrong. It's more like the guide is trying to live a life as a person of moral character. I know you're probably right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
I think the key word is
Scott is right.
The key word is character.
There's no authority that is coming in and telling you how to.
Correct. Yeah,
that's what I mean. There's no outside authority in Aristotelian virtue ethics that's coming in, because that would be that would be more like deontology.
Right. Yeah.
And so you're supposed to act this way because you've cultivated this virtue in you. Now, it's not a habit. That's a big important thing. Virtue, you don't have the habit of honesty. The difference between an honest person and a virtuously honest person, according to the ancients, like a virtuously honest person will never tolerate dishonesty. They won't laugh at a joke that is about dishonesty. They'll only surround themselves and do business with honest people. They and here's another way to think about it. Technically speaking, for a person who has cultivated virtue, the virtue is not hard to do. So, for example, if I come across a wallet on the street and I don't have any money, and I see this wallet, I go, what's the right thing to do? And then I said, I'm going to
look through it to see if there's any money in it.
Yeah, and there's money in it. And I turn the wallet in. That would not...
What are you turning it into?
Because that's the police. I don't know, the police. So, but if I felt this temptation to keep it, then I'm not a true virtue ethicist. I haven't yet cultivated virtue. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, or because of whatever. But it's not if it's hard for me to do it because I'm facing this temptation, then I haven't cultivated the virtue enough. And so this is the last point I'll make about virtue ethics. It exists on a degree with people. You're supposed to cultivate it, but it's also embodied within you. So it's a natural outpouring of a characteristic that resides in you and has been cultivated in you and that you continue to cultivate. It's not a rational, it's not something that you decide to do for moral reasoning purposes.
I bullet pointed it because this is the difficult conversation. I have all of sort of like the ethical theories this is the most difficult one to wrap your head around because it is so non-specific. In Aristotle, I think it's pretty simple. The modern versions of this have gone in so many loops of this, and I think it's, if you ask somebody, what does it mean to be virtuous? If you're sort of into virtue ethics, it's difficult. It's very difficult to define, which is why I think you're right. You define it by a contrast. But at the end of the day, I think in Aristotle, it's just a person who lives a life of moral character. Now, this is all, and you do that sort of by the practice of developing morality. Again, so how you get so non-specific. The Batman example came from two philosophers who have been trying to explain this to people for a long time, Mark White and Robert Arp. And they use the Christian Bale Batman, The Dark Knight.
Go ahead.
Well, it's no, it works so. It works so because it's by contrast, right? So there's a point in The Dark Knight where Batman has the opportunity, Joker's all tied up, hanging upside down, and Batman can drop him and kill him if he wants, or he can take him into jail, right? These are Batman's two options, and he's forced with this moral dilemma. Now, if you were sort of, I'm going to break out consequentialist and utilitarian a little bit here. If you were like a straight up consequentialist and you're Batman, you'd kill the Joker because if you don't, likely he's going to escape from prison and come kill you one day, right? So the consequence of you not killing him for you would be that he's probably going to kill you one day. If you're a utilitarian, you kill the Joker because he's an obvious menace to society. And the utility of having him gone for greater society is, and just out of the picture completely, dead, no more. The utility of that for society is better than the utility of him being in the world still and murdering people. If you're sort of a deontologist, you don't kill him because murders were wrong, and this would clearly be murder. He's tied up, he's defenseless at this point, so it would clearly be murder. Murder is wrong. Now, and this is kind of where it lands in the Dark Knight movie, is in virtue ethics, you're going to have to decide whether you're the type of person that would be a murderer or not. And you act on that. And so in the movie, Batman decides that he's not the type of person that murders, and he lets the Joker live. And if you watch the rest of the movies, eventually the utility of that, or if you follow the Batman story in your life, the utility of that chose to be bad. But at the end of the day, Batman decides that this is his line. This is how he stays virtuous, by not murdering. The problem with virtue, the big problem that everyone has with virtue ethics is just what I said earlier, that it's a guide but not a rule. And when you talk about ethics, people want rules. They want rules, right? They want to know what's right and what's wrong. This is the whole thing with ethics. Ethics is, people study ethics and think about ethics because they're trying to figure out what the heck to do and what the heck not to do. And they want somebody to tell them. Within virtue ethics, it's not that simple. If you're trying to develop the life of a character that shows that you have the character of a moral person, at the end of the day, when you said self-centered, you have to kind of decide what that looks like. And since we here all sort of decide differently, under virtue ethics, I can consider myself to be a very virtuous person who might have, 30 sex partners or something like that. And if you're sort of a deontologist and the sort of or the divine decree, like I said, don't commit adultery, for you, that's going to mean that you're a sinner because this is something that's decreed by God to be wrong. And this is where this gets all weird and fuzzy.
And to your point, Scott, it's almost like what makes this so complicated is actually where you put your simplicity, in my opinion. So with the deontologist and utilitarianism, things are rather simple. There's either a rule or there's a way that you can think about how utility works or consequences to actions. That seems simple. But for the virtue ethicists, they think that's too complex. They think the simplicity, see, in virtue ethics, there is nothing below virtue. So in the other examples, deontologist, utilitarian, you act in a certain way to cultivate virtues. But in virtue ethics, there is nothing below virtue. Virtue is the foundation. It's so simple. Like, virtue isn't made up of things or other concepts. There are no other concepts. So there is love, for example, as a virtue. There's nothing that makes up love. Love is the starting point on all of it, of whatever will then comprise acting virtuously in love. Honesty is a virtue. There's no concepts within honesty that can define it in such a way that makes it utilitarian or behaves. So it's, in some senses, it's almost overly simplistic because it's not made up of other concepts that give rise to it. So the virtuous person knows how to act virtuously. That's what makes them virtuous. They define the virtue.
Which is why they have to write, books that are thousands of pages long to describe it, because everybody just knows it.
Is part of that the shallowness of it, Bruce? Because at least historically, it's tended away from any sort of metaphysic. I think like Cicero's On Duties, which is probably the classic text on this, where Cicero, for all intents and purposes, was a Stoic, and those guys were agnostic towards metaphysical reality, generally speaking. But for them, the thing that was most important is developing this virtue, right? And that is
I would say, this is my own language, and you guys can correct me, this is my own synthesis of it. I see virtue ethics as essentially being little I incarnation. It's the same concept of the incarnation, in that you incarnate the virtue, you become the virtue, and then you live it out. So just as Christ comes and he takes on flesh and he lives as God and man in our presence, and therefore it redefines what man is and what God is all at the same time. The virtue ethicist, in its pure form, from like Aristotle, I see it as an incarnation. You are the embodiment. The true virtuous person is the living embodiment of the virtue. The virtue doesn't exist as an idea outside of, it's not a concept. It's an active living thing within the person and society. So there's a virtuous person. That's what's different.
Here's the virtuous person. Adam and Bruce, correct me if I'm wrong, but I always think it's funny with Aristotle and Cicero on this, is that this is a thing, right? So I struggle a little bit with your saying, Bruce, that this isn't a habit, because if you read, sort of the Nick Ethics, or if you read Aristotle, or if you read Cicero on Duty, you do get the sense that the way that this character and the sort of moral character is developed is by the practicing of the habits of a virtuous person. And this is what these books are about. They're sort of delineating this idea. Now, I'd say in sort of the ancient writings, it's a little more specific than it is in some of the modern writings on virtue ethics. But the funny thing about both Aristotle and Cicero is that this isn't something that they're writing for all people. It's not like they believe that the plebes could become virtuous. Am I wrong there? I mean,
I think the missing thing here is the teleology of virtue, that there's an orientation toward a good. I mean, it's been a while since I've read or closely studied the Nicomachean Ethics, but I mean, I think virtue is not habit in the sense that it's not simply doing something repeatedly, but
it's shown by habit.
It's shown by habit. It's and through repetition, the person is oriented to the good of
that's what I'm going for.
This, that, or the other thing. I mean, I'm reaching deep here because Aristotle is not what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, but a virtuous man can cultivate virtues which are directed towards any number of ends. Like, I mean, the practical one would be, Caleb's not here, but he likes to go fishing, right? Well, fishermen. If I were to go fishing, I haven't done it in probably 15 years. I would be terrible, but through the repeated practice of the art of fishing, one can become an excellent fisherman, right? And that
right.
and so
or the fisherman can be revealed.
Yeah, the fisherman can be revealed, but there's this orientation towards something, and that's why virtue is lived within.
But you're not going to delineate. Being a good fisherman means that you go out and you catch 10 trout a day.
Yeah.
Well,
which is sort of the difference between sort of a definable sort of this is hitting the mark and this isn't hitting the mark.
Aristotle says that it's not a habit. Virtue's not a habit because it's something more like a personality trait.
No, I agree that it's not a habit, but
it's not.
Telos. Aristotle is always one thing. It's always one thing.
Yeah.
The teleology always goes to eudaimonia or happiness, but probably better translated nowadays as flourishing. And this is one of the criticisms of virtue ethics, is that it's self-centered because it's geared towards human flourishing, but all through the individual's rubric of living out their virtues. So, for example, you could imagine a person who always behaved in a virtuous manner, but that was not necessarily always good for society or for other individuals. So this might not be a perfect example, but take for someone who behaves honestly in all their dealings, such a hypothetical person. So they go to the store and they buy a cell phone, and the cell phone's made by kids in mines harvesting rare earth metals, but they bought it honestly. So they can say they had virtue, like they can say they were virtuous, but the system is such that even in their virtue, they're sort of capitalizing on other things. So the point, though, that Aristotle is getting at with all of the virtue stuff is he says it all leads to eudaimonia, the Greek word for this flourishing. It's you, each person, each individual, if they are virtuous, will be happy. They'll be content. They will reach the point where their life isn't about trying to do things to become happy. They're not going to exploit others to be happy. They're not going to become violent to be happy. They will become happy within themselves, and then that will make society better. If everybody maximizes this, then everyone will be happy. So that's where the teleology of this in Aristotle goes, is this flourishes the community when everyone acts virtuously.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a book by the Swedish Lutheran theologian Anders Nygren called Agape and Eros, and the question of love is related to this, but we haven't really talked very much about it yet on this program. But one of the great criticisms that Nygren has, and maybe I'm shifting the discussion towards the theological register, but he charges much of the Christian tradition of ethical reflection and human formation with what he calls eudaimonism, which is to say that the cultivation of happiness is the goal of Christian living and of salvation. He attacks this on the basis that it basically is legalistic in the sense that it focuses upon the attraction of the human being to an object of love, which is God. And so this is all bound up with virtue for Nygren, and he sort of positions the Reformation and Martin Luther against this whole legacy of conceiving of God as the highest good, which is to be loved, the cultivation of virtue as the end of Christian living, and then on the other hand, in contrast, the Reformation is this kind of exodus as Gerhard Forde sort of would later distill, I think, Nygren's insight about the Reformation, that salvation is an exodus from virtue to grace. So,
what beyond, that's a good example, but beyond that, how has this made it into sort of the discussion? Why is this Finnish pastor asking us, hey, a lot of the young guys seem to be really into this. I can't figure out whether it's good or bad. What do you think?
Well, I think that virtue is, there's a very influential book by Alistair McIntyre written in the early 80s. It's been republished many times, or reprinted rather, called After Virtue.
Virtue, yeah.
And McIntyre's claim is that pretty much all modern ethics after Kant, famous German philosopher, devolves into preference. That is a gross oversimplification of a really excellent book, but that ethics after the Enlightenment becomes incredibly flat because what we are doing when we say something is good or bad is we're simply stating preference, but it doesn't have any sort of substance to it. So McIntyre kind of offers this return to Aristotle in a kind of postmodern register, postmodern condition, that we ought to return to virtue as a way of reconceiving a substantial relation to the good within the postmodern condition. So I think, and this is just my perspective, that there's a great deal of metaphysical stability and moral stability to be found in the deposit of antique Mediterranean ethical and metaphysical thinking. And I think for people who are particularly anxious about the way in which the modern world challenges classic Christian and ancient Western morality, say about sexuality, I think that's probably the main source of anxiety. If you are anxious about or panicked about the challenge of the modern world to classic Christian or classic Western moral thinking on issues like sexuality, who else would you turn to but Aristotle?
And well, exactly. I mean, that's exactly.
Is this making sense? Am I?
No. So here's. So After Virtue comes out, and then just it gets sort of. I'd say there was a I won't call it a rediscovery of this, but of it After Virtue, but maybe somewhat of a rediscovery of it. What about 2014, 15, 2012, 13, 14, 15, right in there, sort of just really gets picked up again. And you have to ask yourself what's going on around this time too. So why would this be something that's really picked up by Christians at this time? Well, this is when sort of the assault on what you might call sort of classical Christian morality, specifically regarding sex and sexuality, really takes off. And McIntyre is right, that post-Kant ethics has devolved into preference, especially in what we'd call the quote-unquote postmodern world. This was the big criticism of postmodernism from the time Adam and I were in college moving on, that it takes right and wrong and capital T truth and devolves it into this is how I feel about it, and how I feel about it is just as valid as whether or not it's right or wrong or whether or not it's true. And this assault goes on, for years and years and years and years, to the point where now we have people saying that they can, even if they're born a boy, they can prefer to be a girl. And the craziness is that now where we've gone from just sort of even the postmodern, where my preference is good and your preference is good, is their preference to now be called a girl and to act like a girl is now forced on the rest of us in some sort of cultural way, where if we do not call them according to their new preference of what they think they are in their head, there are some sort of consequences that can be put on us. We'd be deplatformed, demonetized, all this other garbage, right? And so Christians are freaking out about this, and they're rightly freaking out about this. And so they reach out to where would you reach if you want sort of a good ethical system? Well, heck, why not reach to Aristotle and Cicero? Are you going to, on sort of just a level?
You're asking.
Well, I mean, but if on a level playing field of like practical information on this, why not reach out to some of the smartest people that have ever lived and written on these issues?
Who are in our tradition. Which, by the way, And that virtue ethics also has touch points in Confucius and Mencius, to the great Chinese philosophers. So
I knew he was going there. I knew he was way too much for me. But here's the funny thing about it to me is I think this conversation, I just watched the PBS documentary on Ronald Reagan. And so the Just Say No campaign of Nancy Reagan is in my head, which is totally made fun of now, right?
It's really the Nancy Reagan presidency, but go ahead.
Oh, come on. Come on, man. I feel like I'm watching PBS.
You just outraged the boomer con.
Oh, you just outraged the Scoticon over here. But, that campaign is now like widely made fun of, right?
Yeah.
It's a trope. Just saying no. But at the end of the day, you were just saying no because doing drugs was either just deontologically wrong, or it was in a utilitarian and consequentialist sense harmful. And so this is why you just said no, right? You just said no because Adam and Bruce remember this, because there's going to be a frying pan with some sizzling butter in it, and somebody's going to have an egg,
your brain,
and they're going to crack the egg and put it in the hand. They're going to say, this is your brain with the egg, and then they're cracking, put it into the brain, and the egg's going to have sizzle and fry. This is your brain on drugs, right? That's consequentialism right there. And the just say no is deontology. Now, why have pastors get onto this? Because that's a trope now. Why is it a trope? Because practically speaking, it seems like it just didn't work, right? It just seems like just saying murder's wrong didn't work. Saying licentiousness is wrong just didn't work. Even if you said in a sort of beyond deontology, a divine decree sense, God says it's wrong, which is sort of the classic Christian position here on this, which is always why I sort of get confused when virtue ethics makes it into Christianity, because we have, the law. So this always gets a little bit confusing to me. God says it's wrong. They feel like that didn't work. So now you need something more. You need a deeper argument. You need something that appeals more to, like Bruce said, the individual, right? Is it so? You come up with combining Christianity and virtue ethics.
Is it? I'm thinking of two things here right now. One is it because virtue ethics is a little more sophisticated than divine decree ethics? You think?
I think it's more sophisticated. It's more personalized too,
or it looks more sophisticated. We should say.
I think it appeals to the theologian of glory in all of us. Okay. I mean, Bruce said that the biggest, I forgot exactly how you phrased it, Bruce, but one of the biggest criticisms of it is that it's so personal.
Yeah. Self-centered.
And you even said that it's a type of incarnation, right? So what is a theology of glory? Well, theology of glory is incarnating yourself as God and then sort of trying to live that out in your religious experience. And thus it's going to focus on you being and doing what is good, right, and salutary.
Question. I got a question for you before you get further down the road. I wonder, you say like 20, you're putting the most recent iteration of this in the 20 teens, right?
Well, what's the date for gay marriage becoming legal?
2015.
Okay, I put it right around there. During that discussion, just before it and after.
Well, I wonder, I don't know, and just for the record, I'm a big fan of classical education, but if you look at like real classical education, not the sort of parochial fake versions of it.
I mean, the way the emphasis antiquity.
Yeah. Sort of like that is all revolves around and ordered by virtue or a character formation.
Yep.
And you see I don't remember what year it was, but there is this renewed interest in classical education that goes back, was it around in the 90s? I can't remember, but I remember growing up and it starts popping up in my late teens, early 20s. And I wonder if just this renewed interest in the classics injects some influence.
I don't know. I mean, this is all speculation at this point, and I'm sure people have written, papers on this that I haven't read, but
novels.
Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, the faithful, the quote unquote faithful Christian world, and I'd call it that, freaked out after gay marriage, and rightly so. I'm not criticizing.
I think the freak out is intensified since COVID. I don't think that it's died down at all. I think it's just ramped up.
No, but then from that point you have, gay marriage was like the cracking open of the door.
Yeah.
And now it seems like, or the crack in the dam, let's not mix metaphors here, the crack in the dam, and now it seems like the dam has utterly collapsed and the lake is just draining.
Part of the temptation and the problem I think that Christians anywhere also face is it's very hard to think about these issues apart from your cultural political bias. And I don't necessarily even mean left versus right, although that would entail it. But for example, after MacIntyre wrote After Virtue, it was really seen as a defense of Marxism.
Yeah.
And a lot of people felt that the book defended MacIntyre was very critical of the USSR, and he hated Nietzsche. But the consequence of what he wrote ended up sort of supporting the Marxists, among other things, the sort of Marxist idea of being anti-capitalistic, because capitalism exploits people in order to get ahead, and Marxism, at least in its theory, is
I wouldn't say that was maybe the Finnish Lutheran pastors, because but that's not where this goes within sort of Christian Lutheran circles in the States.
No, but here's my point. My point is that even if you attack virtue ethics and you end up getting a Marxist defense out of it, which is what happened with MacIntyre, it's so hard for us to talk about virtue or think about virtue outside of the lens of the Western political framing that we have inherited. So nationalism and the liberal tradition, these things, we see them as almost implicitly Christian. And certainly Christianity gave rise to the West, but some of these are Greek ideas that came even prior to Christian thought, and they're not necessarily opposed to Christian thought, but Marxism has a love for neighbor implicit within it that isn't anti-Christian, even if people don't like its expressions. So I'm just saying, people, when they have, one of the things I see in Lutheranism that's happening is that, to John's point, yes, virtue ethics is appealing because of the collapse of comforting Western cultural values. But in some ways, it's actually a secularization and maximizing of those same Western values, not an abandonment of them.
Well, I would say, practically, or anecdotally, in my experience, when a person actually tries to live this out, like to its fullest extent, it initially does go kind of rather Marxist. The other direction I've seen it go is kind of like a ethical anarchism kind of thing. Like it's so self-centered. Anyway, but the question that the pastor from Finland asked is this sort of helpful or harmful theologically? It, to me, isn't a different question than if you're talking about any sort of ethical system done as theology. In that you'd say it can be helpful. I even think of this as Bonhoeffer all the time, right? It can be helpful. But there's a reason, specifically with Lutheran, there's a reason why Lutheranism has always historically avoided, laying down full ethical systems. And that reason is because no matter what you do with that, if you spend that much time focusing on it, you will in your head, because we are all very good theologians of glory at the end of the day, you will in your head start connecting living this ethical life in some way, shape, or form to how you are saved. Or at least this is the thing that you have to guard against when you focus this much on any ethical system, including virtue ethics. Now, the thing with virtue ethics is there's been extreme attempts to tie this into how one lives the Christian life, and to define the Christian life by means of some sort of virtue ethics system. Now, again, maybe that's more helpful than some other ways of trying to define it. I don't necessarily think so, but I do know that the danger remains the same, that it's difficult to keep your salvation on account of grace alone, through faith alone, and account of Christ alone. It's difficult to keep that as foremost to, Christianity, when all you're talking about is how do I live, 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 how do I live?
This is going to sound sort of predictable for me, but the problem, I think, with virtue ethics is not, does this have some sort of practical value? Obviously, Luther and Melanchthon originally reviled Aristotle, but reintegrated the Nicomachean ethics back into the curriculum because of the practical value, but not because Aristotle should be sort of giving us an agenda for theology. But the problem here that you're pointing at, Scott, I think is one of eschatology, which is that there's not a recognition of the absolute and utter disjunction and difference between the law and the gospel, between the old world in which virtue will help you live well under the reign of sin, death, and the devil, and then the utterly and completely new reality of the gospel, which for now is only given in the word of promise and received in the means of grace and believed in faith, but not something that can be attached as if virtue was going to get you to this new eschatological reality of the gospel. And I think that a lot of these political, because what this comes down to is politics. People are anxious about the political realm, but they're anxious about how are we going to live well together, and the collapse
about the world of the law.
Yeah, the collapse of Western values worries people rightly, but the issue, I think,
it worries me.
It worries me too. I absolutely understand the panic and the paranoia. I share it. However,
I have children and grandchildren. It freaks me out.
Yeah, of course. But what we as Lutherans can't do is take this panic, paranoia, and the sort of bunker mentality of going back to the stable, safe confines of Aristotelian ethics, and then make this our salvation, because Aristotle's not going to save you. Your only salvation is in Christ alone.
Amen. And the worst versions of this I've ever seen, and I don't want to pick a big fight here, but was sitting in a church playing a video, and it was an adult education video, and the person that was teaching there, really, if he didn't outrightly say these were the words of Jesus, the implication was this is how Jesus wants you to live. And it was straight out of the Nick Ethics. It was straight out of Aristotle. And so where this gets just, I'll say dishonest maybe, is when sort of Aristotle is baptized. You go back and you buy Aristotle says some good stuff. I can't believe Melanchthon struggled with this. I can't believe he's not going to be saved. Well, let me just go back and baptize him. And if I can just, draw a direct comparison between the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Aristotle, maybe I can make such a connection here that I can imply that that what Aristotle says is how Jesus wants you to live. Now, Jesus gave us two words. He gave us the law and the gospel, right? And at the end of the day, when he gave us the law, he gave us a law in order to show us that he was the only hope for salvation. And then when he gave us the promise, he was promising us that through him we would have life also. Now, this is not the same as what Aristotle is doing, or Cicero. It doesn't mean that what Aristotle or Cicero are doing is bad or is not helpful, in a virtuous society, which is the world of the law, by the way. But it just means that it's not the project for which Jesus came. Jesus came to save you and to say, that I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, and that no one will come to the Father except by me. That was the project. The Aristotelian project's not the same project.
I'm in complete agreement with you, but it raises a question for me, a consequence to what you're saying, which is sort of, okay, so if it's true that the words of Jesus and the morality of the New Testament should avoid marriage with a secular or even well-intended quasi-Christian system, how do Lutherans not become quietists? How do they live out their morality in the other kingdom, informed from their faith, inspired by the truth of their faith, but still saying, I have a responsibility to be a moral agent and to require normative claims of morality on the society. So in that sense, would virtue ethics be a good thing?
Well, I mean, this is the 500-year-long conversation anytime Lutherans start talking about salvation.
Yeah, but it's the conversation Lutherans are living now on it.
Oh, I know. But I mean, I just don't want to, we have this tendency because the crack in the dam has turned into a flood in the valley. We have this tendency to believe that everything's new, right? But when you ask that question, I just want to point out that from the moment Luther first elucidated the gospel, this was the question. This was the question that Erasmus asked him. I mean, this was the question that had been asked of him throughout his life. This is the question that's been asked of us. You focus so much on Christ coming to save sinners. Did Christ not teach us anything about how to live? And at the end of the day, the question is, well, of course he did. And of course, when he gave quote unquote moral teachings on how you should live, he meant it. He said, this do or you shall die. And at the end of the day, that was true. Apart from him, if you do not, let's just go to the Ten Commandments, if you do not live perfectly, the Ten Commandments, you will die. Thus, everyone was doomed to die because no one lived the Ten Commandments perfectly. Thus, God sent Christ to be a savior. Now, post becoming Christian, the question, how then, the Francis Schaeffer question, right? How then should we live? Is a worthwhile discussion, but it's not the discussion of how do I become a Christian. The discussion is, I am a Christian because Christ died for me. There is a sub-question here, which is, how then shall I live? And that should be examined. There will be multiple answers to that. The historic and classic Lutheran answer is through vocation, right?
And I think that I would probably say that
other responsibilities.
I would sort of say, though, that the one thing that Christians contribute to the practical side of living is that in terms of vocation, I mean, Christians, non-Christians have vocations, they have callings, whether they know it or not, conscious of it or not. What the Christian knows is the end, right? The conclusion, that this old world is passing away, and that the only thing that endures will finally be the word of the gospel, and that there is a resurrection of the body on the other side of this. And so now that you've abandoned the idea that your morality down here and back here in the old world, in the old nature, the old creature is going to get you to the other side where you really want to be, now you can really be free. And I think that's the comfort of the gospel.
Let me add something that's, I think, is really important. Laws of any kind of ethical system might change behavior for a time. Okay? Focusing on it might change behavior for a time. But the only thing that is going to change a person in a permanent basis is the proclamation of the gospel, because it's the only thing that we know that is promised to change the heart, right? Even some. It doesn't mean that you will still live your life as saint sinner your entire life until God brings you home. to glory. But the proclamation of the gospel, and if people want to know why we focus so much on it, is the only thing that changes the person. It's the only thing that's promised to in the text, to change the person, to change that heart of stone into a heart of flesh, which might be the answer to why, whether or not they had, perfectly delineated ethical systems or not, Christian societies throughout history have been the ones who have eventually attained sort of the greatest, quote unquote, external morality of any society in history. Even if you want to point out to Christian societies had slavery, my answer would be for a time. All right. They're also the only societies in history that abolished slavery. These still exist to some degree in pagan societies. They don't in the Christian world anymore. Why? Because they had a perfectly delineated ethical system? No, of course not. But these are people, that you have the promise that the gospel that not only saves you, but actually makes a difference to you here and now too. In the here and now changes who you are to some degree. Now, does that sound a lot like virtue ethics? It might, because it's not as definable as this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, it is the thing that makes you actually, not that you are going to live it perfectly, and certainly not that you're going to live it to the level that it'll save you, but it does make you now, as a Christian, see the law for what it is, which is not just that thing that damns you, but also God's will for your life. Now, does that mean that you're going to fulfill that enough so that you're saved? Never. Absolutely not. And only Christ and the promise and the proclamation of that promise and faith will do that for you.
All right. I think we're getting close to time, fellows, but I do want to make sure that we include Adam if he has a final comment, because he looks like he's about to say something.
I've been sitting here antsy, but I wanted to say, Scott, so you're not an antinomian.
I knew that was going to come up on this episode.
But I also think this is for probably another episode, and I don't, Scott, your toes will probably curl when you hear me say this. I really think, and I think because Luther called it the nut of his theology, that this sort of two kinds of righteousness is a really helpful guide in how to live in this world.
You're right, my toes did curl.
Seeing this temporal, vertical pursuit of, for lack of a better way of describing it right now, righteousness, that,
right.
With a temporal end in mind, and only a temporal end in mind, that has no bearing on your alien or horizontal righteousness.
That's the eschatology
very helpful.
I was talking.
Honestly, Adam, these days I long for the days of two kinds of righteousness.
Well, we should have a.
Sounds like another episode. You'll have to invite me back for that one, but we probably should wrap up at this point. I want to extend my thanks to the listener for putting up with this, your humble guest host, in the absence of one Caleb Keith. He will be back next week, but we thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinking Fellows, and we hope that you once again go over to 1517.org/podcasts and find all kinds of other great resources similar to this one, to this podcast as well. Thanks for listening, and see you later.